And by her adopting Moses, he was heir to the throne. You know, we all are familiar with the movie The Ten Commandments. The interesting thing that may surprise you is most of that was based on excellent research. This whole concept of him being a rival for the throne against a natural but junior son may have some substance to it relative to the writings of Josephus and others. And so that the idea that we're going to find from the Scripture that he refused the throne. There's some things that the movie takes violence with in terms of real spiritual understanding of the situation. But we're going to discover that this idea of Moses being not just taken care of by Pharaoh, but being heir to the throne has a basis in the Scripture. We could get into a whole thing here, by the way. Was it appropriate for Moses' parents to avoid, if they knew that the babe had a destiny in God's will, was it right for them to seek means to avoid him being killed? There's a whole issue here. You know, some of us as Christians say, well, gee, I know God, if it's God's will, I'm immune, right? That wasn't Christ's attitude. In Luke 4, verse 30, and John 8, verse 59, and other places, you'll notice that Christ, with all his knowledge, often would resort to normal means to avoid a confrontation, even though he knew he would win the confrontation. And there are a number of cases where he was in extremis, and he would slip away. Without a miracle or a clash of thunder or earthquakes and stuff, he would just resort to reasonable means to avoid the problem, even though he had foreknowledge to know that it was in the cosmic destiny for him not to be taken at that point. So this whole business of using lawful means to avoid danger is very reasonable, even for one who is called by God to a mission. This also means that civil authorities are to be defied when their actions are clearly contrary to the manifest express intention of God in the situation. So we could draw many lessons from this, but in the interest of time, we'll keep moving on. Verse 11. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. Now, we've just leaped over a lot of issues. Before we get to verse 11, there's some things between verses 10 and 11 that should be pointed out. Was Moses saved during his youth? Probably not. I think we don't know. That's a fair thing. Was God's supernatural hand on him to preserve him? From that, we can draw the inference that God is able to preserve the elect through their unregeneracy. Interesting idea. Let me turn to Jude. First verse in the epistle of Jude. Jude was a brother of Christ. Both James and Jude were his brothers, according to Matthew 13 and Mark 6 and what have you. Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ, the brother of James, to them who are sanctified by God the Father and preserved in Jesus Christ and called. Mercy and peace and love be multiplied. In the Greek construction of Jude's gospel, those verbs are very critical, very important, and in the right order. You are sanctified, preserved, and called in that order. Very interesting idea. I like to emphasize that, lest you think you had much to do with it. In Job chapter 5, verse 13, we know the Lord taketh the wise in their own craftiness. And we see that here. Pharaoh's own schemes to kill the babes is not only thwarted, but his enemy, if he knew who he was, is in his own household. He's providing the lodging, the food, the schooling, the protection, all the accoutrements of the court are being granted to his daughter's adopted son. So the very man that really is his intended adversary is being preserved by Pharaoh's own resources, which I think is kind of interesting. We know a lot of the interval here, and it might be worth doing it. We looked at Acts chapter 7. That commented briefly on this period. It said in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, it says, And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in words and deeds. And when he was a full 40 years old, he came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel, and so forth. And it tells how he oppressed and smote the Egyptian, and we're going to come to that in a minute. And he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. It recounts this whole issue that we're about to read. You might hold your finger here because we'll come back to that. But also I wanted to call your attention to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24. Remember, we picked up verse 23 about the parents of Moses listed there. Let's pick up verse 24. It says, by faith, Hebrews 11:24, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, meaning he declined the throne or his right to the throne of Egypt, choosing rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. He esteemed the reproach of Christ. How interesting. You trying to tell me that Moses was informed? That's what it says. He did this by faith, not dumb luck, not by blind choice. By faith, meaning he somehow understood. He chose, it was a knowledgeable choice, rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy pleasure of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. Strange thing. Verse 28, through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. And it goes on. Well, verse 29, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as dry land, which the Egyptians attempting to do were drowned. Okay, verse 11, it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked upon their burdens, and he observed an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. He looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses didn't mess around. When he went out to the second day, Now, this isn't a week or two later for the rumor mill to get going. I remember that Ford Motor Company had a campaign many years ago about their car. It said, swift as a rumor and silent as a secret. And I always thought that was very descriptive. Yeah, swift as a rumor. The next day, when he went out, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews, they were arguing. They strove together. And he said to them that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? Now he intervenes. These 2 guys are having an argument, and he steps in to try to take sides, I guess. And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou didst kill the Egyptian? That shook him up. Because he steps into this argument, he gets hit with this, and they obviously know the word's gotten out that he killed this Egyptian. He would have expected them to be grateful, right? Not so. Moses feared and said, surely the thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And he ends up in Midian, by the way, 40 years. That's a long time to be on the bench. You're taken out of the game, waiting. You can make an interesting study of how many of the great men of God were on the bench 40 years before they're called into service. A lot of them. A lot of them. Most of them. It's also an interesting study is to discover how many people meet an important gal by a well. Remember Eliezer in Genesis 24? How Eliezer finds Rebekah where? By a well. Right? Where does Rebekah finally meet Isaac? By the well of Lahai-Roi, the living water. Of course, we all know the woman by the well in Samaria. And so forth. So it's kind of interesting that he's by a well. So I guess if you're in the Old Testament and you're trying to meet the right girl, you do it by the water. I guess just like today during coffee break, I suppose. Verse 16. Now, by the way, this might be the right place to. You can take Acts 7 and amplify it on your own, because I'm going to try to see if we can't get through this chapter before the time runs out. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to Regel, there's a couple of Reguel, there's different pronunciations perhaps, their father, he said, how is it that ye are come so soon today? In other words, they finished early because they had help, see? They said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us, and watered the flock. And he said unto his daughters, and where is he? Why is it that ye have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread. Yeah, a man with 7 daughters is anxious to find out who this guy is. Yeah. Verse 21, and Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter.